The sun beat down on the parched earth of Wyoming territory, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Elias Vance, a man weathered by solitude and sorrow, dug a post hole near the porch of his isolated cabin. The rhythmic thud of his shovel against the hard-packed soil was the only sound for miles, save for the distant cry of a hawk. He had inherited this land from his grandfather, a man he barely knew, and it had been nothing but a burden, a constant reminder of the life he was trying to outrun. Elias had arrived 2 weeks ago, and the cabin was in a state of disrepair. The roof leaked, the windows were boarded up, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. His only companions were the ghosts of his memories and a worn-out saddle he'd carried since he left his old life behind. He was a man of few words, his past a locked vault no one dared to open. But the silence of the prairie had a way of bringing things to the surface, and Elias found himself wrestling with ghosts he thought he had buried long ago. He was in the middle of patching a creaky floorboard inside the cabin when he noticed it. A slight unevenness, a small gap where the wood didn't quite meet. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't indulged in a long time, tugged at him. He pried at the board with the tip of his knife. It was a tedious process, the wood old and stubborn, but he was patient. Finally, with a groan of protest, the plank came loose. Beneath it was a small, crudely built wooden box. He pulled it out, his heart a drum against his ribs. Inside, nestled among faded papers, was a small, ornate key. A note, yellowed with age, was tucked beneath it. Elias unfolded it, the script a spidery scrawl he recognized instantly as his grandfather's. "Elias, if you're reading this, it means you've come home. I hope you find what I've hidden. It's the only thing that matters. Follow the moon when it's full, and you'll find the door. The key will unlock a new life, a new purpose. Don't be afraid. It's time to open the door." Elias stared at the note, his mind racing. A hidden door, a new life. He scoffed, throwing the note back into the box. His grandfather was a strange man, given to cryptic pronouncements and grand gestures. This was probably just another one of his eccentricities. But the key felt real. It was heavy in his hand, a small, tangible link to a past he couldn't shake. The next full moon, Elias couldn't help but feel a pull towards the back of the cabin. The note had been a silly notion, but the curiosity was a gnawing ache he couldn't ignore. The moon was a perfect luminous disk in the night sky, casting long, eerie shadows. He walked towards the small, dilapidated shed behind the cabin, the one he hadn't even bothered to look inside. The key felt warm in his palm, as if it had a life of its own. The shed was a mess of rusty tools and old lumber. Elias's eyes scanned the back wall, and he saw it, a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. A small, almost invisible seam ran down the center. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling a small indentation. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. With a shiver of anticipation, he slid the key into the crack and turned it. A click echoed in the stillness, and a section of the wall slid away, revealing a dark tunnel. A gust of cold, musty air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old earth and something else he couldn't quite place. Elias pulled a lantern from a hook on the wall, lit the wick, and peered into the darkness. He took a single, hesitant step inside. The tunnel was narrow, the walls lined with rough-hewn stone. It led to a small, hidden chamber. Inside, sitting on a makeshift cot, was a girl. She was thin and pale, her eyes wide with fear. Her arms were wrapped around a young boy, no older than 4, who was sleeping soundly, his head nestled in her lap. The girl's clothes were tattered, and a nasty gash ran along her cheek. She looked up at Elias, her eyes a mix of terror and defiance. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a reedy tremor. Elias lowered the lantern, his hand shaking. "My name's Elias. I inherited this place. Who are you?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on his face, her fear slowly giving way to something else, hope. The boy stirred, letting out a soft whimper. The girl's hand went to his head, stroking his hair. "His name's Lucas," she said softly. "I'm Sarah. We need help." Elias was a man who ran from trouble. He had seen enough of it in his life, but as he looked at the two of them, the fear in Sarah's eyes, the innocence of the sleeping child, something shifted inside him. He couldn't turn his back on them. He wouldn't. He had found a hidden door beneath his floorboards, a secret his grandfather had left him, and everything had just changed forever. Sarah was a whirlwind of guarded energy, a constant hum of fear and vigilance. Elias brought them food and water, and as she ate, she kept a wary eye on him, as if expecting a trick. Lucas, on the other hand, was an open book. He toddled around the cabin, his small, curious fingers touching everything. He was a source of light in the dim, dusty cabin, his laughter a foreign, beautiful sound. Over the next few days, Elias learned fragments of their story. They were on the run from a group of outlaws, men who had killed Sarah's parents and were now after her and Lucas. She wouldn't elaborate on the details, a wall of silence guarding her secrets. Elias didn't push. He understood the need for silence, the way it could be a shield against a world that had shown you nothing but cruelty. He started to work around them. He'd chop wood while Sarah tended to Lucas, a silent rhythm forming between them. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitude, was now a home. He fixed the leaky roof, mended the broken windows, and even built a small new fence around the porch. He was no longer just surviving. He was building, creating a space for three people he barely knew. One evening, as Elias was sharpening his knife, Sarah sat across from him, her gaze fixed on the fire. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can just leave us. We'll be fine." Elias stopped, his eyes meeting hers. "No, you won't," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Those men, they won't stop, and I can't leave you here." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping us?" He didn't have a good answer. The truth was, he didn't know. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the sheer exhaustion and fear he saw mirrored there. Maybe it was the way Lucas had reached for his hand that morning. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first time in a long time that he felt like he was doing something right, something that mattered. He put his knife down. "Let's just say, my past is messy, and I've done things I'm not proud of, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah didn't say anything more, but the next morning she was a little less guarded, a little more trusting. She told him about her parents, a small ranching family in Texas, and how a group of men had come to their ranch, claiming it was theirs. She had managed to escape with Lucas, her younger brother, and had been on the run ever since. She had heard of her family's old friend, Elias's grandfather, and had sought him out only to find the cabin abandoned. She had found the hidden chamber and had been living there, waiting, hoping. Elias listened, his heart aching for her. He had seen his share of greed and violence, but the story of these men, their cruelty, enraged him. He knew he had to protect them. The unspoken promise between them solidified. He would be their protector, their sanctuary. The peace was fragile, a delicate veil that could be torn apart at any moment. Elias was constantly on edge, his senses heightened, his gun always within reach. He taught Sarah how to shoot, her small hands unsteady at first, but she was a quick study, her determination a fierce flame. He saw the strength in her, the resilience that had kept her and Lucas alive. One evening, as the sun was setting, Elias saw them. 3 riders on the horizon, their forms silhouetted against the fiery sky. He grabbed his rifle, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Get inside. Take Lucas. Go to the tunnel." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lucas, who was playing with a wooden horse, and ran into the cabin. Elias watched as the riders drew closer. He knew these men. He had seen their kind before. They were scavengers, wolves in the dust, and they had a scent for blood and fear. They stopped at the edge of his property, their leader, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, dismounting. "Well, well, look what we have here," the man said, his voice a low growl. "A lone wolf in his den." "This is private property," Elias said, his rifle steady in his hands. "Turn around and ride out." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We're looking for a girl and a boy. You seen them?" Elias's face was a mask of stone. "I haven't seen anyone." The man's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. We know they came this way, and we know who you are, Elias Vance. They say you're a ghost, a man who disappeared without a trace. Seems you found a new purpose, a new family, a new weakness." A shiver of cold dread ran down Elias's spine. They knew his name, they knew his past. His sanctuary was no longer safe. The man drew his gun, a slow, deliberate movement. "I'll ask you one last time. Where are they?" Elias knew he had only one choice. He raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger. The crack of the gunshot echoed in the stillness, and the man with the scarred face fell to the ground, a hole in his chest. The other two men were on him in a second, guns blazing. Elias dove behind a pile of lumber, the bullets splintering the wood around him. He returned fire, his aim true, and one of the men fell. The last one turned and fled, disappearing into the twilight. Elias stood up, his body trembling, the acrid smell of gunpowder in the air. He walked over to the fallen men, his stomach a knot of dread. He had done it. He had killed them. But he knew this was just the beginning. The man who had fled would come back, and he wouldn't be alone. Sarah emerged from the cabin, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked at the bodies, then at Elias. You saved us," she whispered. Elias just shook his head. "I did what I had to, but it's not over. We have to go. Now." He gathered what they could, their few belongings, some food, some water. He saddled his horse and another for Sarah. They couldn't stay. The cabin, their safe haven, was now a beacon, a target. As they rode away, Elias looked back at the cabin, his heart heavy. It was a place of new beginnings, a place where he had found a new purpose. But it was also a place of death, a grave for the ghosts of his past. The road was long and unforgiving. They rode for days under the scorching sun and the cold, star-dusted nights. Elias was their guide, their protector, and he found himself falling into a new rhythm, a new purpose. He taught Sarah how to read the stars, how to find water, how to survive. He was a man who had always been alone, but now he was a father, a brother, a protector. Lucas was a constant source of wonder. He would point at a bird, a rabbit, a flower, his small voice filled with a joy that was infectious. He saw the world with a sense of wonder that Elias had lost long ago, and in his small, innocent way, he was healing Elias, mending the broken pieces of his heart. Sarah, too, was changing. The fear in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a fierce determination. She had found a new strength, a new resolve. She was no longer just a victim, she was a survivor. She and Elias would talk at night, their voices low, sharing stories of their past, their dreams for the future. He learned about her life in Texas, her parents' love for the land, her hopes to one day have a family of her own. She learned about his, a dark and painful story of betrayal and loss that had led him to this lonely stretch of land. The bond between them was growing, a silent, unspoken thing that was more powerful than words. Elias found himself looking at her differently, a flicker of something more than just admiration in his eyes. It was a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time, a connection that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was falling for her, a dangerous and foolish thing to do in a world where every moment was a fight for survival. One evening, they made camp near a river, the water a cool, soothing sound. Sarah was tending to the fire, Lucas sleeping soundly in a blanket. Elias sat beside her, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Where are we going, Elias?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at the map he had been studying. "There's a small town, about 2 days' ride from here. It's called Redemption. It's a quiet place, a place where people go to start over, a place where we can be safe. A small, hopeful smile touched her lips. Redemption, she whispered. I like the sound of that. Elias reached out, his hand hovering over hers, a silent, clumsy gesture of comfort. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gently placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, a small, fragile connection in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The fear was still there, a constant shadow, but for the first time in a long time, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. He had found a hidden door beneath his floorboards, and it had led him to a new life, a new purpose, and a new family. He just had to get them to Redemption. The town of Redemption was a small collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single dusty street, a general store, a saloon, a church, and a few scattered houses. It was a haven, a place where they could finally rest, finally breathe. Elias rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a place with a small porch and a view of the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Sarah found work in the general store, her quiet strength and gentle nature a welcome addition to the small community. Lucas spent his days playing in the dust, his laughter echoing through the quiet streets. Elias, ever the loner, kept to himself, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. The ghosts of the men he had killed, the ghosts of his past, haunted him still. One day, as he was buying supplies, he saw them. Two men, their faces grim and their eyes cold. They were the men who had been with the scarred man, the men he had killed. They were looking for something or someone. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. They had found them. He rushed back to the cabin, his mind racing. He had to get Sarah and Lucas out. He had to protect them. But as he entered the cabin, he saw that Sarah had been expecting him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with a fierce determination. "They're here," she said, her voice a whisper. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We can't keep running, not anymore. We have to face them, together." Elias looked at her, at the raw courage in her eyes, and knew she was right. Running had only made them a target. It was time to fight, but he wasn't going to let her fight alone. He was going to fight with her. That night, they prepared. Elias drew a map of the town, marking the places where they could hide, the places where they could fight. He taught Sarah how to use a rifle, how to reload it quickly, how to aim for the heart. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the resolve, the determination to protect her brother. The unspoken promise between them had grown, solidified into an unbreakable bond. The next morning, the town was quiet. The two men were waiting, their forms a stark silhouette against the rising sun. Elias and Sarah stood on the porch, a silent, united front. They were ready. The men started to walk towards them, their hands on their guns. "We know they're here, Vance," one of them said. "Hand them over, and we'll let you go." Elias just shook his head. "I'm not handing anyone over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not getting them. Not today. Not ever." The men drew their guns, and the sound of the first shot echoed through the quiet street. The gunfight was quick and brutal. Elias, a master of his craft, moved with a lethal grace, his rifle a part of him. Sarah, with her newfound courage, was a force to be reckoned with, her shots finding their mark. The townspeople, who had been hiding in their homes, emerged, their faces filled with a mix of fear and admiration. In the end, the two men lay dead in the dust. The town was quiet again, the only sound the distant cry of a hawk. Elias and Sarah stood on the porch, their hands still shaking, their hearts pounding. They had won. They had faced their past, their demons, and they had won. The aftermath of the gunfight was a blur. The townspeople, once wary, now looked at Elias and Sarah with respect. They had saved them, saved their peaceful town from the shadows of the past. The sheriff, a man with a kind face and a weary soul, shook Elias's hand. "You did the right thing, son," he said. You protected the innocent." Elias just nodded, his eyes on Sarah and Lucas. They were safe. That was all that mattered. Over the next few weeks, the town of Redemption started to feel like home. Elias started to build a life there. He bought a small plot of land and started a small ranch, his hands finally finding a purpose beyond just survival. Sarah continued to work at the general store, her laughter a welcome sound in the quiet town. Lucas, now with a small wooden horse of his own, would spend his days playing, his innocence a beacon of hope for them all. The bond between Elias and Sarah deepened, a quiet, steady flame. They would sit on the porch at night, under the starlit sky, their hands intertwined. They talked about the future, about their dreams, about a life where they didn't have to look over their shoulders. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of belonging. One evening, as the moon was a perfect, luminous disk in the night sky, Elias looked at her, his heart full. "Sarah," he said, his voice a little shaky, I love you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and a beautiful, radiant smile touched her lips. "I love you too, Elias," she whispered. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that was a promise of a future filled with love, a future they had fought for, a future they had earned. But the past had one last shadow to cast. A few months later, a rider came to Redemption, a grim-faced man with a message. The leader of the gang, the man with the scarred face, had a brother. And that brother, a man named Silas, was a ruthless killer, a man who would stop at nothing to avenge his brother's death. He was coming for Elias. He was coming for them. The news hit Elias like a physical blow. He had thought it was over. He had thought they were safe. But he knew this was different. Silas was not a scavenger. He was a hunter. He would not stop until he had his revenge. Elias told Sarah, his voice heavy with dread. She looked at him, her face pale, but her eyes still filled with that fierce determination. "We'll face him," she said, her voice firm. "Together." He shook his head. "No, this is my fight. You and Lucas have to leave. Now. Go to the next town. I'll meet you there." "Elias, no!" she pleaded, her eyes filled with tears. "You can't do this alone. We're a family. We face this together." He looked at her, at the raw courage in her eyes, and knew he couldn't convince her to leave. He also knew he couldn't face Silas in the middle of town, where innocent people could get hurt. He had to lure him out, away from the town, away from his new family. He had to use the one thing he had left from his old life, his knowledge of the land, his skill with a gun. He rode out of town that evening, leaving a note for Sarah. "I love you," it read. "I'll be back." He rode towards the mountains, towards the wilderness he knew so well. He would face Silas on his own terms. Silas was a ghost in the dust. Elias didn't see him, but he felt his presence, a cold, malevolent energy that was a constant shadow. He rode for 2 days, a cat-and-mouse game, until he reached a narrow canyon, a place known as Dead Man's Creek. It was a perfect place for an ambush. He dismounted, his rifle in his hands, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Silas appeared on the horizon, his form a dark silhouette against the fiery sunset. He dismounted, his eyes a cold, unwavering stare. "Elias Vance," he said, his voice a low growl. "I've been waiting for you, for this." "This isn't your fight, Silas," Elias said, his voice steady. "Go back. There's nothing for you here." "My brother's blood is on your hands," Silas said, his eyes filled with a cold, ruthless rage. "You took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you." He drew his gun, and the showdown began. It was a dance of death, a ballet of bullets and dust. Elias, a master of his craft, moved with a lethal grace, his rifle a part of him. But Silas was just as good, a formidable opponent, his every move calculated, his every shot precise. The gunfight was brutal and unforgiving. Elias was hit, a bullet grazing his arm, but he didn't falter. He knew he couldn't. He was fighting for his life, for his family, for the future they had built. He was fighting for redemption. The final shot was a long, excruciating moment. Elias's bullet found its mark, and Silas fell to the ground, a hole in his chest. Elias stood over him, his body trembling, the acrid smell of gunpowder in the air. He had won. He had faced his last shadow, his last demon, and he had won. But as he looked at the dead man, a deep sadness settled over him. This was the end of a long, painful road, the end of a life filled with violence and loss. He had found a new life, a new purpose, but the ghosts of his past would always be a part of him. He rode back to redemption, his body aching, his heart heavy. He found Sarah waiting for him at the edge of town, her face a mixture of fear and relief. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around him, her tears a warm comfort on his cheek. "You're back," she whispered, her voice filled with a profound sense of relief. He just held her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his heart full. He was home. He was safe. He had won. But he knew the journey wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, a new life filled with love, a new family, a new hope. The months that followed were a time of healing and hope. Elias's wound healed, and the ghosts of his past slowly faded into the background. He and Sarah were married in the small church, the townspeople a silent, loving presence. Lucas, now a young boy, was their son in every way that mattered. Their life was a quiet, peaceful rhythm. Elias worked on his ranch, his hands finally finding a purpose beyond violence. Sarah tended to their small garden, her laughter a constant source of joy. They had built a life, a home, a family. They had found their redemption. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the moon a perfect luminous disk in the night sky, Elias looked at Sarah, at the beautiful woman who had taught him how to love, how to hope, how to live. "You know," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion, "I found a hidden door beneath the floorboards of that cabin, a secret my grandfather left for me." Sarah smiled, her hand in his, and everything changed forever. He looked at her, at Lucas, who was sleeping soundly in his arms, and knew she was right. He had found a hidden door, a key to a new life, a new purpose, and he had found his redemption. And as he looked out at the star-dusted sky, he knew the future was a promise, a new dawn, a new life, a new hope.